Normandy, France. August 1944. A column of American infantry advances along a hedgerow-lined road. The soldiers are veterans, careful men who have survived the beaches and the brutal bocage fighting. They move in tactical formation, weapons ready, eyes scanning every tree line. They face machine guns, mortars, artillery and tanks. They think they know what the battlefield can throw at them. They are wrong. From a concealed position behind a stone farmhouse, something opens fire. The sound is unlike anything they've heard before. Not the steady hammer of an MG-42, not the crack of a rifle. This is something mechanical and relentless, a cyclone of metal that doesn't stop. 20mm rounds tear through the hedgerow as if it doesn't exist. They shred trees, they cut through vehicles, they go through walls. Men who are behind cover discover in the worst possible way that the cover they've chosen is meaningless against this weapon. The firing lasts perhaps 8 seconds. In those 8 seconds, 4 men are dead and 7 are wounded. The survivors scatter, pressing themselves into ditches behind stone walls, anywhere. The platoon sergeant, a man who has never once hesitated under fire, finds himself frozen. He doesn't know how to fight this. Nobody told him how to fight this. What opened fire from behind that farmhouse was a Flak Panzer IV Wirbelwind, a German anti-aircraft tank, designed to shoot down airplanes, doing something else entirely. The story of the Wirbelwind is one of the most instructive case studies in the history of improvised military adaptation. It begins not with a grand design program or a visionary strategist, but with a crisis. A fundamental existential crisis that changed the nature of the air war over Germany and forced the Wehrmacht to think quickly about how to protect its armoured formations from destruction from above. To understand why the Wirbelwind was created, you need to understand what was happening to German armoured columns in 1943 and 1944. The Luftwaffe, which had provided Germany with undisputed air superiority through the early years of the war, was being systematically ground down. British and American strategic bombing campaigns were consuming German fighter strength. More importantly for ground operations, Allied tactical air power was growing exponentially. Typhoons, Thunderbolts, Mustangs and Spitfires were being equipped with rockets, bombs and cannon, and unleashed on German ground targets. These fighter bombers could locate and destroy armoured columns with horrifying efficiency. Tank crews began to describe the experience of air attack with words like helplessness and terror. A Panzer IV, which could defeat almost any ground threat it encountered, was essentially defenceless against a Typhoon diving at over 500 km/h, firing rockets. The tank's thick frontal armour meant nothing when the attack came from above. Engines, turrets, vision ports, all were vulnerable from that angle, and fighter bombers rarely came alone. They hunted in pairs and flights, making repeated passes until their ammunition was exhausted. The existing solutions were inadequate. Germany had developed the SDKFZ-7/1, a half-track mounting a quadruple 20mm anti-aircraft gun. This vehicle was effective but lightly armoured, vulnerable to the very air attacks it was trying to counter, and to ground fire as well. Earlier Flak Panzer attempts, including the Flak Panzer I and conversions based on the Czech 3080T chassis, had proved too lightly armed or too cramped. The Wehrmacht needed something that combined adequate firepower with the ability to keep pace with panzer formations and survive the battlefield environment. The solution came from a somewhat unexpected source. In 1944, a junior officer named Oberleutnant Werner Döhler, working with a field modification program, designed what would become the Wirbelwind. This was not a top-level design program handed down from the Heereswaffenamt, the Army Weapons Office. It was a practical engineering response to a tactical problem, created by men who understood the problem firsthand because they were living with its consequences. Döhler's concept was elegant in its simplicity. Take a Panzer IV hull, the backbone of German armoured forces, reliable, well understood, easy to maintain, and replace the standard turret with a purpose-built open-topped rotating mount carrying a Flak-Vierling 38, the famous quadruple 20mm anti-aircraft gun system. The Panzer IV would provide mobility and protection for the crew while moving. The open-topped turret would allow the gun's maximum elevation and traverse for engaging aircraft. The Flak-Vierling 38 was already a known quantity. It had been in German service since 1940 and had proven highly effective against low-flying aircraft. The quad mount combined 4 separate 20mm Flak 38 cannons into a single weapon system, all controlled and fired by one gunner. Each individual barrel could fire at a cyclic rate of approximately 450 rounds per minute, giving the combined system a theoretical cyclic rate of 1,800 rounds per minute. Practical rates of fire accounting for reloading and overheating were lower, typically around 700 to 800 rounds per minute total, but even this figure was staggering. The Wirbelwind could put an enormous volume of 20mm rounds into the air in a very short time. Let's examine the weapon itself in more detail, because understanding the Flak-Vierling 38 is essential to understanding why the Wirbelwind became so feared. The 20mm round it fired was not a small cartridge. It was 20 by 138mm, a substantial projectile capable of causing catastrophic damage to light aircraft and structurally significant damage to medium aircraft. The round came in several variants, including high explosive, armor-piercing and tracer configurations. High explosive rounds were fitted with point-detonating fuse that detonated on contact, creating a burst of fragments capable of igniting fuel tanks, severing control cables, and killing aircrew. Armor-piercing rounds could penetrate light-armored vehicles, thin aircraft skins, and any light cover that infantry might be sheltering behind. The 4 barrels of the Flak-Vierling were arranged in pairs, offset from each other. 2 barrels fired simultaneously on the first pull of the trigger, and the other 2 fired on the release, creating a rapid alternating cycle that felt to the operator almost like continuous fire. The feed system used curved box magazines holding 20 rounds each. Reloading was performed by ammunition handlers, and this was a limitation. The magazines were relatively small and had to be changed frequently during sustained fire. Experienced crews could change magazines quickly, but under combat stress, with ammunition handlers working in an open turret exposed to return fire, the process could slow considerably. The turret designed for the Wirbelwind was a 9-sided open-top polygon, fabricated from 16mm armor plate. This was sufficient protection against small arms fire and shell fragments, but not against heavy machine gun fire or any anti-tank weapon. The open top was a deliberate compromise. Enclosing the turret would have reduced the gun's elevation capability and created severe problems with propellant fumes that had to escape somewhere. German designers considered the trade-off acceptable, since the vehicle's primary operating environment was intended to be behind the front lines, where ground fire threats were presumed to be minimal. The turret sat on the standard Panzer IV hull, which provided the 4-man crew with a familiar and proven platform. The hull retained its original Glaciers armour and drivetrain. The Panzer IV's engine, the Maybach HL 120TRM 12-cylinder gasoline power plant producing 265 horsepower, gave the vehicle adequate mobility on roads and reasonable cross-country performance. Maximum speed was approximately 38 km per hour on roads, dropping significantly off-road. This was not exceptional performance, but it was sufficient. The Wirbelwind was not designed to lead attacks. It was designed to protect formations, moving with them at their pace, positioned where the air threat was greatest. Production began at Ostbauwerke in Sargen in mid-1944. The total number of Wirbelwinds produced is the subject of some historical debate, with figures typically cited between 87 and 105 vehicles. This small number reflected the pressures Germany's industrial base was under by 1944. The Panzer IV hulls needed for conversion were required for tank production. Skilled workers were scarce. Raw materials were increasingly difficult to obtain as Allied bombing disrupted supply chains. The Wirbelwind competed with numerous other urgent programs for resources, and it consistently lost these priority battles. Yet even in these small numbers, the Wirbelwind had a disproportionate impact on the battlefield. Part of this impact was mathematical, and part was psychological. The mathematical case is straightforward. A single Wirbelwind could put approximately 700 to 800 rounds per minute into the air against attacking aircraft. Those rounds covered a wide cone of fire that an attacking pilot had to fly through. Even brief bursts from the quadruple mount created a pattern of 20mm explosions dense enough that evading all of them required exceptional skill and some luck. Against the relatively slow ground attack passes that fighter bombers made, the Wirbelwind's fire envelope was genuinely dangerous. Allied pilots began to take note. In post-mission debriefings, encounters with flak panzer units were specifically reported and analysed. Attack profiles had to be modified, standoff distances increased, dive angles altered to minimise exposure time. The psychological case is harder to quantify, but equally real. Armoured column commanders who had previously watched helplessly as their vehicles were bombed and strafed now had something to fight back with. Tank crews could advance with more confidence, knowing that at least some anti-aircraft protection was moving with them. Conversely, fighter-bomber pilots who knew flak panzer units were present in an area became more cautious, which directly reduced the effectiveness of Allied tactical air power in those sectors. The operational deployment of Wirbelwind units followed a standard doctrine. These vehicles were not distributed evenly throughout formations. They were concentrated in flak panzer sections, typically operating as pairs or small groups attached to panzer regiments and Kampfgruppen, the battle groups that increasingly became the standard organizational unit as Germany's forces were stretched thin. The Wirbelwinds would position themselves at the flanks of columns and near critical choke points, road junctions, bridge crossings, and supply routes, where air attack was most likely. When a formation was moving, the Wirbelwinds moved with it, scanning the sky. Crews developed a system of aircraft identification, learning to distinguish Allied fighter bombers from their own aircraft by silhouette and engine sound. This was imperfect, and there were tragic incidents of friendly fire, but it was the best possible system given the circumstances. Radar fire control, standard on larger fixed anti-aircraft installations, was not available on these mobile platforms. Engagement was by eye and experience. The engagement sequence against aircraft followed a well-drilled procedure. The gunner tracked the target using a reflector sight calibrated for aerial gunnery, leading the aircraft and accounting for its speed and approach angle. The commander called out range and bearing corrections. Ammunition handlers prepared the next set of magazines. At the appropriate moment, the gunner opened fire in controlled bursts, sweeping the gun slightly to create a beaten zone in the aircraft's flight path rather than attempting to track precisely, which was effectively impossible at the closing speeds involved. Against a Typhoon or Thunderbolt approaching at 400 or more kilometers per hour, the engagement window was measured in seconds, but in those seconds the Wirbelwind could deliver dozens of 20mm rounds. Hits on aircraft engines or fuel systems were frequently fatal to the aircraft. Hits on the cockpit area were fatal to the pilot. Even hits on wings or fuselage created structural damage that could force the aircraft to break off its attack, or, in severe cases, cause in-flight failure. Allied records from the Normandy campaign and the subsequent fighting across France confirm that flak panzer-equipped formations were significantly harder to attack from the air than formations without this protection. Typhoon pilots of the 2nd Tactical Air Force reported that attacking columns where flak panzer vehicles were present required multiple passes at increased risk, and that the accuracy and intensity of fire from these units was notably greater than from conventional anti-aircraft positions. But here is where the story becomes more complex, where the Wirbelwind became something its designers hadn't fully anticipated, a weapon that redefined what ground troops understood about suppressive fire. The transition of the Wirbelwind from pure anti-aircraft role to ground combat weapon was not a planned development. It emerged from the desperate tactical realities of 1944 and 1945, as the Wehrmacht found itself fighting defensive battles against numerically superior ground forces across collapsing fronts. The same characteristics that made the Wirbelwind effective against aircraft. The enormous volume of fire, the high explosive rounds, the ability to rotate and engage targets in any direction also made it extraordinarily devastating against infantry. Consider what 700 rounds per minute of 20mm fire means in practical terms for ground targets. Each round that hits a human being produces catastrophic injuries. The 20mm high explosive round, designed to destroy aircraft structure, contains a significant explosive charge for its size. On contact with any solid surface, it detonates, sending fragments in a radius that can injure or kill. Unlike rifle bullets, which must strike a target directly, 20mm HE rounds have a lethal radius that extends well beyond the point of impact. For infantry in the open, the Wirbelwind's fire was essentially unsurvivable without substantial cover. The rounds were coming faster than the human nervous system could process the threat. By the time a soldier heard the sound of fire and began to react, dozens of rounds had already arrived. Even soldiers in foxholes or behind earthworks were at risk from rounds impacting the edge of their cover, sending fragments downward into the protected space. For infantry in light cover, the situation was worse. The bocage hedgerows of Normandy, the stone walls of French and Belgian villages, the wooden buildings that dotted the European landscape, none of these provided meaningful protection against 20mm rounds. The weapon punched through earth banks that would stop machine gun fire, It turned stone walls into clouds of lethal fragments as rounds detonated against the masonry. Wooden buildings offered no resistance whatsoever. For infantry and vehicles, whether half-tracks, trucks, jeeps, or wheeled armoured cars, the Wirbelwind's fire was almost instantly fatal. The armour-piercing capability of the 20mm round allowed it to penetrate the thin skins of most soft-skinned and lightly armoured military vehicles. A burst of perhaps 2 seconds duration could destroy a truck, set a half-track on fire, and kill everyone aboard. The psychological effect of encountering this fire in a ground combat context cannot be overstated. Combat veterans who had absorbed the experience of machine gun fire, artillery bombardment, and mortar attacks had developed a mental framework for managing fear on the battlefield. They understood how to use terrain, how to move tactically, how to choose cover. The Wirbelwind broke this framework. Its fire was too fast, too dense, and too destructive for conventional infantry tactics to counter effectively. Veterans who fought against Wirbelwinds and similar flak panzer weapons in Normandy and across France described a specific kind of fear, not just of being hit, but of watching terrain and cover that should have protected them being simply erased. Cover that stopped bullets, cover they trusted with their lives, was suddenly no cover at all. This created a particular form of tactical paralysis that was difficult for unit commanders to overcome. The sounds of a Wirbelwind firing are worth describing, because they contributed significantly to its psychological impact. The flak-veering 38's 4 barrels created a distinctive mechanical rhythm, higher pitched than an MG42, more rapid than a 37mm cannon, and relentless in a way that larger weapons could not be. Allied soldiers and commanders who survived encounters with the Wirbelwind described the sound in their after-action reports with remarkable consistency, often comparing it to fabric tearing at enormous volume, or to a mechanical scream that seemed to fill the entire landscape. Veterans who encountered this sound learned to associate it immediately with a threat that required immediate abandonment of position and retreat, which was, of course, its own tactical victory for the Germans. Let's examine specific engagements where the Wirbelwind's ground combat capability was documented, because these accounts, drawn from military records and veterans' testimonies, illustrate the weapon's real-world impact more clearly than technical specifications can. Normandy, July 1944. The fighting in the bocage country had become a grinding attrition battle. Both sides were exhausted. The terrain, with its dense network of high earthen banks topped with thick hedgerows, forced combat into a series of small, vicious engagements at close range. A Wirbelwind operating in support of a Panzer Grenadier company was positioned behind a tree line, covering a road junction that American forces were attempting to seize. When the American advance came, infantry and light vehicles moving down 2 roads simultaneously, the Wirbelwind's crew held their fire until the American vehicles were committed to the road, with limited ability to maneuver. The subsequent engagement lasted less than 90 seconds. The American platoon took heavy casualties, 3 vehicles destroyed, multiple men killed and wounded. The survivors took cover in the drainage ditches alongside the road and could not move for over 2 hours, pinned by the threat of renewed fire from a position they couldn't locate precisely, suppress effectively, or outflank without exposing themselves in open ground. This account, drawn from the after-action report of the American unit involved, illustrates something important about the Wirbelwind's tactical effect that goes beyond the direct casualties it inflicted. The 2 hours of paralysis that followed the initial engagement effectively removed an entire platoon from the battle for the rest of the day. Troops who were pinned could not advance, could not support adjacent units, could not be used for other tasks. The resource cost to the American side was far greater than the physical casualties alone suggest. France, August 1944. During the Allied breakout from Normandy, German forces were attempting to conduct a fighting withdrawal through a landscape increasingly dominated by Allied tactical air power. A Wirbelwind attached to a Panzer IV company was moving along a secondary road when Allied fighter bombers, Typhoons of the 2nd Tactical Air Force, located the column. The Wirbelwind crew engaged the attacking aircraft immediately. One Typhoon was hit and forced to break off its attack run before releasing its rockets. A second was damaged and subsequently crashed approximately 8 kilometers from the engagement. The remaining aircraft completed their attack but with degraded accuracy due to the anti-aircraft fire. The column suffered less damage than comparable unescorted columns typically experienced. This engagement appears in the operations record of the German unit involved and is cross-referenced with RAF's 2nd Tactical Air Force loss records, which confirmed the loss of 1 Typhoon and damage to a 2nd during operations in that sector that day. It represents exactly the kind of outcome the Wirbelwind was designed to produce: preservation of armoured assets that would otherwise have been destroyed from the air. The Battle of the Bulge, December 1944. During Germany's Ardennes offensive, Wirbelwind-equipped units advanced with the Panzer spearheads through the dense Ardennes forest. The winter conditions, with low cloud ceilings and poor visibility, had temporarily neutralised Allied air power, removing one of the Wirbelwind's primary functions. But the weapons found immediate utility in a different role: direct fire support during the breakthrough fighting. In the dense forests, visibility was limited. Engagements happened at short range. The volume of fire the Wirbelwind could deliver in a brief burst was decisive in clearing defensive positions that had stopped Panzer Grenadier advances. American soldiers defending positions in the Ardennes reported the psychological devastation of the weapon's ground fire. One account from a survivor of the 106th Infantry Division describes an engagement near Schönberg in which a Wirbelwind opened fire on an American position at approximately 300 meters range. The soldier describes the experience as, quote, "like nothing before or since. The trees around us just came apart. Everything was exploding at once. Men who were behind cover, men I thought were safe, were being hit by fragments coming over and around the cover. There was no way to fight back against it. We ran. We all ran." This first-person account captures something essential about the Wirbelwind's ground combat effect. It wasn't just the casualties it caused, it was the way it disrupted the fundamental tactical logic that infantry depended on. When the weapons and cover you rely on to fight back are neutralised, when the terrain features you use to survive become irrelevant, the only rational response is to withdraw. And withdrawal, in the context of a broader engagement, often means ceding ground, losing positions, and disrupting the defensive plan that the entire operation depends on. The Ardennes campaign also revealed one of the Wirbelwind's significant tactical limitations in ground combat. The open-topped turret, designed to maximise anti-aircraft capability, was a serious vulnerability in ground engagements. American and British mortar crews, once they identified a Wirbelwind by its sound and fire signature, would attempt to drop mortar rounds directly into the open turret. At short ranges, this was technically challenging but possible. Artillery forward observers would call in adjusting fire aimed at getting rounds to airburst over the Wirbelwind's position, sending fragments down into the open turret. American infantry learned to use these tactics, and their effectiveness forced Wirbelwind crews to operate with more caution during ground engagements, increasing distances and reducing exposure. This was a rational adaptation, but it also reduced the weapon's effectiveness in the close-range fighting that characterized much of the Ardennes battle. The psychological and tactical adaptation that Allied forces had to make when encountering Wirbelwind-equipped formations is documented in multiple operational records. By late 1944, American infantry training was beginning to include specific guidance on countering flak panzer vehicles. Recommended tactics included immediate use of smoke grenades to obscure the vehicle's sight lines, flanking movement to attack from angles the turret was not currently covering, concentration of anti-tank weapons, including bazookas, to attack the vehicle's thinner side and rear armour, and calling for artillery support to either destroy the vehicle or force it to relocate. These recommendations were sound, but implementing them against an active Wirbelwind in combat was extremely difficult. Smoke grenades had to be deployed while under fire. Flanking movements exposed soldiers to fire from the Wirbelwind and any accompanying infantry. Bazookas required getting to within about 150 meters of the vehicle and having an unobstructed shot, neither of which was easy to achieve under conditions where the vehicle's crew was actively suppressing the surrounding area. Artillery took time to coordinate and arrive. The Wirbelwind's strengths were thus most pronounced in the crucial initial moments of an engagement, when its firepower advantage was greatest and before the enemy could mount a coherent response. Experienced Wirbelwind crews exploited this by engaging decisively, inflicting maximum damage quickly, and then relocating before the enemy could bring effective countermeasures to bear. This pattern, engage, devastate, displace, was central to the Wirbelwind's tactical success, and explains why it inflicted casualties and disruption disproportionate to its numbers. A single Wirbelwind that engaged effectively and then moved before it could be destroyed might repeat this cycle multiple times in a single day, appearing in different positions, creating the impression of a much larger force and tying down enemy attention and resources far beyond what one vehicle should theoretically be capable of. Beyond its direct combat effects, the Wirbelwind forced Allied commanders to think differently about how they employed their tactical air power. Fighter bomber missions in areas where flak panzer units were known to be operating had to be planned with greater care. Single aircraft making individual attack runs, which were effective against unescorted columns, became much more dangerous. Formation attacks, where multiple aircraft made simultaneous runs from different angles to saturate the anti-aircraft defences, became necessary, requiring more aircraft per mission and greater coordination. This increased the cost in aircraft, fuel, pilot hours, and mission planning of every tactical air attack in sectors where Wirbelwinds were present. The Wirbelwind also influenced the development of German follow-on flak panzer designs. The Ostwind, which replaced the quadruple 20mm mount with a single 37mm flak 43 gun, was developed in part because operational experience with the Wirbelwind identified limitations in the 20mm round against more heavily constructed aircraft, and suggested that a larger caliber weapon might be more effective at longer ranges. The Kugelblitz, an enclosed turret flak panzer with twin 30mm cannons, represented a further evolution, addressing the open turret vulnerability while increasing firepower. Neither of these successors reached meaningful production before the war ended, but their development was directly informed by what the Wirbelwind had demonstrated about both the potential and the limitations of mobile anti-aircraft armour. The question of the Wirbelwind's overall impact on the war must be answered honestly and with historical context. In terms of aircraft destroyed, the number of confirmed kills attributed to Wirbelwind units specifically is difficult to isolate from kills made by other anti-aircraft weapons. What is clear from operational records is that formations protected by flak panzer vehicles suffered measurably lower casualties from air attack than equivalent formations without this protection, during periods when Allied tactical air power was active. This preservation of armoured strength, each tank and vehicle saved representing thousands of hours of manufacturing labour and scarce materials, had real strategic value. In terms of ground combat effectiveness, the Wirbelwind's impact was tactical rather than strategic. It inflicted casualties and disrupted operations in specific engagements, but its small numbers meant that it could not be present everywhere it was needed, and many German formations that desperately needed anti-aircraft and fire support protection never received it. The 87 to 105 vehicles produced were spread across multiple theatres, multiple divisions, and multiple combat situations. At any given point on the front, the Wirbelwind was more notable by its absence than its presence. The fundamental limitation of the Wirbelwind was not its design, but its quantity. As with so many of Germany's most effective weapons in the second half of World War II, it was produced in numbers too small to influence the overall course of the conflict, while being effective enough in its area of operation to demonstrate what might have been possible with greater industrial investment. There is also a broader lesson in the Wirbelwind story about the nature of air-ground integration in modern warfare. The vehicle was a direct response to the problem of tactical air power. The problem it was responding to was itself the result of Germany's failure to maintain air superiority, which was the result of strategic decisions made years earlier about aircraft production, pilot training, and the allocation of resources between offensive and defensive aviation. The Wirbelwind was, in a sense, treating a symptom of a disease that had already progressed beyond the point where symptomatic treatment could save the patient. For the Allied soldiers who encountered it, however, strategic context was irrelevant. What mattered was the immediate reality of those 4 spinning barrels, the mechanical scream of the flak-Vierling, and the absolute necessity of getting out of the vehicle's field of fire immediately. In that immediate tactical context, the Wirbelwind was as effective as any weapon the Germans deployed in the final 2 years of the war. Its reputation as a nightmare for infantry was earned honestly in the hedgerows of Normandy, the forests of the Ardennes, and the rubble of a dozen European towns where soldiers discovered too late that the light-armoured vehicle ahead of them was not just an anti-aircraft platform but something far more immediately dangerous. A weapon capable of transforming any open space, any lightly covered position, any street or field or forest path into a kill zone where conventional infantry tactics simply failed. The Wirbelwind does not appear in most discussions of the war's decisive weapons. It has no iconic status equivalent to the Tiger tank or the Stuka dive bomber. It won no famous battles and never appeared at the crucial moment of a campaign-defining engagement. What it did was something quieter, but militarily significant. It made German armoured formations harder to destroy from the air during a period when Allied tactical air power was becoming decisive. It made open terrain around German positions genuinely lethal for infantry at a time when the Wehrmacht desperately needed force multipliers. And it proved, in the most direct way possible, that a weapon designed to shoot down aircraft could be among the most devastating ground combat systems of the entire conflict. The whirlwind of steel that the name Wirbelwind evoked was real. Those who stood in its path understood that with complete and terrible clarity.